Legal experts came out publicly in the past month against a bill the incoming government plans to push, which aims to allow legislators to go forward with laws that the Supreme Court has disqualified. This battle of titans between the judiciary and legislative systems is one of the most prominent issues on the agenda of the Knesset at the moment, and is debated daily by all sides of the political map. What could be the implications of this law? Why could it be problematic? And who should have the final say in the state of Israel? Professor Yaniv Roznai, Associate Professor and Vice Dean of the Law School of the Reichman University and co-director at the Rubinstein Center for Constitutional Challenges, will join us today for a talk about these issues. Good morning, Professor Roznai.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You lead the opposition by many legal experts against this law. Why is this a legal question and not a political one?
Well, it is a legal question because it is a fundamental change in our constitutional structure and in our Bill of Rights. Basically, what the new coalition is aiming for is to introduce what we term an override clause in our basic laws, which would basically allow the coalition, any coalition for that matter, to enact legislation that is unconstitutional. In other words, it violates rights that are protected in the basic laws either in a disproportionate manner or not for a proper purpose. Now, in light of the lack of any serious political checks and balances in Israel, we legal scholars who have signed various petitions are afraid that this would actually give the coalition absolute powers. And we think that that is highly problematic in our constitutional structure.
Okay, but with your proposition or with your objection, you see the courts as the final arbiter in questions that fall within the scope that is between the judiciary and the political system. So why do you prefer specifically people in the judiciary system who actually weren't chosen by the public? Didn't such a process just recently shake the United States in the recent abortion legislation by the Supreme Court?
No, I don't think we are prioritizing final say by the judges rather than the politicians. We are not saying that, and this is not the issue. The politicians can always change the basic laws and amend them. The politicians, the representatives of the public, they have the final say. And this is precisely the problem with the override clause, because the politicians do not and have not abolished basic law human dignity, which is our Bill of Rights, for 30 years. No one would do that because the political costs are extremely high. This is our Bill of Rights. And that is precisely the problem with the override clause, because the override clause would allow the politicians to keep basic law human dignity on the books as if we have a perfect Bill of Rights. But on the other hand, whenever it would be convenient to completely ignore that protection, the Bill of Rights, they can simply enact laws through the override clause. So this would be kind of a mechanism that would legitimize legislation that is unconstitutional. So it's not a matter of who has the final say. It is a matter of whether we want to give the politicians absolute powers in legislation or not. And if we look around the world, the vast majority of democracies do not have any absolute powers or do not grant absolute powers to the legislators. There are various mechanisms that manage to somehow balance the political power. Think, for example, you mentioned the US. So think of a federal system and a presidential system with veto powers, and not to mention a rigid constitution with a full Bill of Rights. Other parliamentary systems have two houses in parliaments, or the countries in Europe are subordinated to the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights. Israel has none of these. We only have one political organ, the Knesset, that is ruled by the coalition leadership, which are 5 or 6 politicians who can actually impose their will through coalition discipline. And in this constitutional setting, providing more powers to the legislators vis-a-vis fundamental rights or the judicial system seems highly risky to us.
But many claim that the judges today in Israel are also, first, a political actor, and that B, they also have absolute power. And when they rule, they actually have authority, but they have no accountability.
I don't think that's correct. First, we need to remember that the judges are appointed by a committee that is also composed by politicians, and you must have the agreement of the politicians in order to be appointed or selected to the Supreme Court. So also the politicians have veto powers over nominations to the Supreme Court. But the court in no way has absolute powers. That is a myth. The court is passive in its reactions. It only has its legitimacy to impose decisions. It depends upon the executive and the political branches in order to basically exercise the decisions that the court itself adopts. And if you look in a realistic perspective on what the court has been doing in the last 30 years, it is true that the court has received or has taken upon itself various authorities. That is true. It can review any administrative action. It reviews ordinary laws. It has even reviewed in several times amendments to basic laws or basic laws themselves. That is true. However, in exercising this authority, the court has been extremely restrained. We're talking in 30 years, it has invalidated 22 provisions of laws. In a comparative perspective, that is almost nothing. And even in administrative challenges against the government, I think about 98% of the challenges are dismissed. So there is no problem of governance. The court does not really block in any way the government from acting in any way it wants. So I think these are all exaggerations, and there is no serious reason to weaken more the court. We actually need to strengthen the court. If we want to bring Israel to the situation of normal Western democracies, then what we need to do, we need to complete our Bill of Rights, which is now lacking. We don't have, for example, the right to equality or freedom of speech. These are not explicitly written in our basic laws. So we need to complete the Bill of Rights. We need to anchor judicial review in a basic law, like 87% of world countries. And if we do that, if we complete the constitutional package, then if the politicians want to have some kind of an override mechanism, we can discuss that. But in any way, in our weak constitutional structure, to have an override, that would be highly problematic.
Okay, let's move on to another bill. The Attorney General specifically objected other bills the upcoming government is introducing, including one aimed at clearing Aryeh Deri's way to a ministerial post. Is this part of a larger trend to reshape the powers of the Knesset versus maybe other institutions, not only the court?
I think this is simply a symptom of what we call abusive constitutionalism, how the Israeli government is, and every government in the last few years, has been changing our basic laws, which are fragile anyway, in order to achieve narrow political aims and interests. So what we have here, the government wants to appoint a certain politicians to a minister, but basically the government basically does not allow that. And what we're seeing is a specific and personal amendment to that basic law in order to allow this particular appointment. I don't think this has a direct link with the relationship between the government and the judiciary, but what we must also remember that all these changes cannot be examined in detached. We need to look at all these changes that are coming in an aggregated and accumulative manner, because eventually they all point to the same point. They point to a point where the government wants to remove and release any limitations or restraints on its power. We cannot appoint someone, no problem, we will simply change the basic law, not an ordinary law, the basic law. This is our constitution. The legal advisory is disturbing us in any way, no problem, we will weaken the legal advisory or capture that position. The court is bothering us, no problem, we will change the way judges are appointed and weaken the ability of the court to intervene. It all points to the same direction, to a government that wants absolute powers. And that is extremely problematic. We see around the world what governments in Hungary and Poland have been doing. We want to keep a strong and vibrant liberal democracy in Israel. We do not want to weaken it.
Okay, maybe the final question is, if these laws do pass in the Knesset, how would you recommend the court and maybe also the public to respond?
I think the public must do whatever it can in a legal manner, of course, to oppose it. After all, our politicians, the Knesset members, they are our representatives and they need to act in the benefit of the public. And all the recent surveys show the public does not want these reforms in the legal system. The public wants some changes in the legal system, but it doesn't want the destruction of the judicial system. So I hope that the politicians will not go forward with it. I think the public should voice its voice, whether it is in protest, etc. As for the court, I really hope that we will not reach to the point where the court needs to intervene, because the court has, as I've said earlier, limited powers. It does not have absolute powers. There are only limited tools in the court's toolkit. I assume that at a certain point, the court would have to put, the border or the red line to maintain its independence, if that would be at stake. But I wouldn't count on the court to save Israel, Israel's democracy. The people of Israel needs to save Israel's democracy, and the politicians. We are still in a stage where many of these proposals cannot pass or should not pass. So the politicians can still block it. And again, I'm in favor of some reform in the legal system. We legal experts have said that we are happy to assist any politician in trying to find good formulas, balanced changes, but not changes that would completely undermine the judicial system in Israel and somehow put out of balance our anyway limited balance of powers or checks and balances. So things have to be made in a serious and slowly manner, and hopefully try to reach to some kind of an agreement between the opposition and the coalition. Because if the new coalition would push forcefully to some changes only on the basis of coalition versus opposition, this might be a victory, but it would be a very short-term victory, because if you want to have strong legitimacy, democratic legitimacy for these changes, they would have to be in a way that is more consensual than only a narrow coalition versus opposition.
Well, we all hope for more cooperation between both sides of the political map. Professor Yaniv Roznai, thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation.
We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.